All right, well, let's get going here. Good morning, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate you dialing in. We know it's not easy to carve out 30 minutes, especially with the ongoings in markets, so we appreciate it. China is clearly an important part of our investment portfolios. It's an important part of our decision-making framework going forward, and frankly, we have a great guest with us today to facilitate those discussions. So, bit of the rules of the road first. So I'm Brad Long, our Deputy Chief Investment Officer here at Fiducient Advisors. We got 30 minutes of time. We'll be respectful on the back end, so we'll try to keep everything within that fairly short window. Ask questions along the way. You can do so by putting them into the chat queue. We'll take those and try to weave them into our discussion fluidly so we can get to as many questions as possible. If we don't get to your questions in the 30-minute time, don't worry. We can follow up with you after or connect you with Matthews Asia to do so. So with that, let's begin. For those of you that don't know Andy, you should. Andy Rothman is the Chief Strategist at Matthews Asia with considerable experience across Asia, in particular with China. Andy's last post with the federal government, I'm going to read this because this is a long title, was the head of macroeconomics and domestic policy office with the U.S. Embassy in Beijing. So we're very glad to have Andy with us this morning. And Andy, thanks so much for carving out the time.
Great to be with you, Brad. Thanks.
So we know you were recently in Asia and Hong Kong and China and Taiwan. So why don't we just begin with kind of your recent observations and experiences having been on the ground? And we recognize not many have been on the ground given COVID-0 and restrictions of travel. So we'd love to benefit from some of those experiences, and then we can start to double click on many of the questions we've been getting from investors over time.
Great place to start. Thanks, Brad, and welcome everybody. Thanks for making time to join us today. So yes, I was able to go back to Asia for the first time in 3 years. I'm pretty sure this is the longest time I haven't been back to Asia and to China since my first trip there in 1980 as a student. So it was really a long time on a relative basis. My first stop was Taiwan. I spent a week there, and largely because Taiwan's in the news so much, right? You're all hearing headlines about how China's getting ready to use force to invade Taiwan. Well, what really struck me is spending a week there talking to people in the Taiwan government, talking to people out of government in the business community, academics, journalists, is nobody I spoke to in Taiwan felt there was a material risk that China was going to use force against Taiwan in the next 5 years. And everybody I spoke to in Taiwan felt that Xi Jinping, the leader of the Chinese government, the Chinese Communist Party, is a rational actor, and that's why he wouldn't use force. So that's quite different message than you get from the headlines here. And I went from Taiwan on to Hong Kong and to Shenzhen in southern China. And the main takeaway from there is that it felt on the ground during my brief trip, and by talking to people based in Hong Kong who've been going in and out of the mainland recently and looking at the data, like the consumer-led economic recovery in China that I was expecting to start in the second quarter is already well underway. And it's begun earlier than I expected for COVID-related reasons. First, I was concerned that some local governments in China might resort back to using lockdowns after Xi Jinping announced on November 11th that he was ending their zero COVID policy, but that hasn't happened. There have been no lockdowns. And second, I was concerned that during the January Lunar New Year holiday, when everybody in China was traveling, there'd be another wave of COVID cases. That too didn't happen. So we're already seeing a domestic demand, consumer-driven economic recovery earlier than I had anticipated. It's a gradual recovery. It's not a dramatic one, but we're slowly getting back to pre-COVID levels in the economy.
So why don't you spend a little bit of time talking about, you mentioned rational actor, right? And when I think of rational actor, I think of, China in particular. Their approach to COVID has been quite different from the rest of the world with COVID-0 policies. And we've just eclipsed 3 years since the World Health Organization, noted COVID as a pandemic. So China has clearly come a long way in a very short period of time. What's the root behind that? Was their hand forced? Was that a change in policy? Like, where do you think that stems from?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that China's zero COVID policy, which basically meant zero tolerance for COVID cases, worked really well in 2021. China had very few cases, almost no deaths from COVID, and arguably they had the world's strongest economy. But that all ended with the arrival of the Omicron variant of COVID. It was just so transmissible that even locking people up at home didn't work. And I think it took the Chinese government too long to understand that. And that was a combination of hubris. They're thinking, hey, we had the best plan in the world and now it's not working. Can we really get our heads around that? So it wasn't, I think, until the lockdowns last spring, especially in Shanghai, which had a terrible negative impact on the Chinese economy, that the Chinese leadership realized that the plan that worked well, zero COVID, in the previous year wasn't working so well now. So on November 11th, Xi Jinping announced that he was done with that. Now, I'm sure many of you have heard about the protests in China, but it's important to keep in mind that these protests came about 10 days after Xi Jinping's speech on November 11th. So my view, and I'm a little bit cautious about this because I wasn't on the ground and I lived in China for more than 20 years, but first time back just last month in 3 years. The protests were really, I think, people saying to Xi Jinping, hey, you said zero COVID was over. You said we don't have to be locked down anymore. We don't have to do PCR tests every couple of days, show QR codes on our phones to get into a restaurant or the gym. And that's still happening. What's the story? And so I think what the protests accomplished was it accelerated the pace of lifting all of those restrictions and getting China's economy back on track again. And of course, with the economy back on track, it's worth remembering a couple of things. One is China is and is likely to continue to be for the foreseeable future the only major economy in the world that's easing on monetary and fiscal policy while the rest of the world is tightening. And second, Chinese consumers really didn't spend very much during the last 3 years. Family bank deposits in China rose by 48% during the COVID period. That was a net increase equal to 5.6 trillion US dollars. It's bigger, way bigger than the GDP of the UK, equal to about 96% of retail spending in China in 2019 before COVID. So families have a huge buildup in savings that they can both draw down on and just feel good about spending on because they've got money in the bank.
And do you think that creates an environment of, it's been dubbed revenge spending, right? Kind of the have to get out or pay more for the same services because you've foregone those services for many years? Or is it more perhaps a gradual reentrance back into the market? Do you have a view there on how that might unfold?
Yeah, I think we need to be realistic that the recovery in China is taking place on a gradual level. So maybe not the kind of revenge spending we had here. And that might be because here, many people got checks from the US government and went out and spent that. In China, Chinese government didn't send checks to families. So that 5.6 trillion net increase in family bank deposits was just money that people had saved on their own. The other thing is Chinese people went through a lot of trauma in the second half of last year with the lockdowns, and then in December with a wave of COVID cases across the country. If we were speaking in late November, I would have told you that almost none of my friends in China had come down with cases of COVID unless they'd come here and caught it. But by the end of December, I could tell you that almost everybody I knew in China had come down with COVID. And so they're still, I think, dealing with the trauma of that. So I think the spending is going to be a steady pickup, but we shouldn't expect it to be off the charts in a short period of time.
Sure, very fair. So on that idea of kind of pragmatism, maybe moving from the consumer back up to the government. So, it feels for Western investors sitting in the United States, we kind of get this ping pong between, is China-US relations increasing or decreasing, getting better or worse? Last week we had Xi's comments on containment and suppression of China, in the US policies. So where do you think Xi and kind of in his third term and party, the CCP, sits on that pragmatism scale? And what does that mean for us as investors?
Well, Brad, thanks for referencing the term pragmatism, because as I think I've been using that word a lot to talk about my fundamental view about China, which comes from almost 4 decades of looking at that country and that economy. And my view is that over the last several decades, Chinese people and the Chinese economy have become rich, and the Chinese government has strengthened its control over politics by being pragmatic. This was something that they clearly weren't before, and they often make mistakes. And sometimes they get away from pragmatism. And that happened last year. So we saw unpragmatic regulatory steps in the tech sector, in the property sector. We saw an unpragmatic approach for several months on COVID. But the good thing is that I think Xi Jinping and the rest of the leadership know that when they get back to pragmatism, it works and that they're successful. So we've seen that on COVID. We've seen that on the property sector, where the government has announced that it was ending some of the restrictions that were strangling the residential property market over the last couple of years. In fact, they've been now promoting sound buying of new homes. They've cut mortgage interest rates in China by about 140 basis points since a year ago. On the tech sector, they've recognized they went too far. And then the last place that I think they realize they need to be more pragmatic is on relations with the United States. We saw that in November when Xi Jinping and Joe Biden had a pretty warm conversation on the margins of the G20 meeting in Bali. We also saw a more pragmatic approach to Australia and to Europe. Unfortunately, all of that was disrupted by the balloon. And I got to say, of all the things that I was thinking about at the beginning of the year that could go wrong in US-China relations, balloons were not on my list. But there we had it. But I also think that both governments realize that they've got to get back to a pragmatic approach, because you're talking about the world's two largest economies. And we have to figure out a way to live with each other pragmatically and push on each other on the issues that we're concerned about. And I still think that Xi Jinping feels that way. So just last night, our time, Li Chang, his new deputy, held his first press conference after taking over that job this week. And one of the things he said is that the Chinese government wants to get back to the engagement that they tried to get started back in Bali when Xi Jinping and Joe Biden met. And I also think that the Biden administration understands this too. So I'm pretty hopeful that there's a recognition of the importance of that relationship and getting it back on track. I mean, think about how important it is for US farmers, for example. China is our biggest market. Think about anybody in your family who might have cancer. If you look at the cooperation on doing trials for cancer drugs, oncologists tell me that cooperation between the US and China is reducing the length of time it takes to get a drug from the lab into American patients by 7 to 8 years. And on top of that, all of our iPhones are assembled in China.
Yeah. And to your point on balloons and mistakes from government, right? There's a lot of potential noise there. And speaking of noise, I'd really love to get your opinion. I think you mentioned you lived in China for 20 years. How does the average person in China think about the US? Think about the US as a construct of government. Think about the US as a market of investment. Like, what's the conversation on the ground?
Yeah, that's a great question. My view, from having lived in China for a long time, dating back to the 80s, is that the vast majority of Chinese people admire most of what's going on in the United States. They look up to the US in many ways. Almost all of them want their kids to go to school in the United States. Even Xi Jinping, his daughter went to Harvard. Even the government, a lot of what they've constructed in the last few decades has been modeled after the United States, from their central bank system to the way their Department of Agriculture tries to help farmers. And I also think that China is not at all like the Soviet Union was. China does not want to rip up or weaken or destroy the global institutions that we helped create after World War II. China has gotten rich and strong by working within those organizations. Do they want to see the rules adjusted to benefit them? For sure. And we need to push back on that inside those institutions. But I think that there's very few people in China who see us as the enemy or as a threat. So I think there is opportunity for us to get past things like the balloon. And we've done this before. When I was working in the US Embassy, for example, in the 1990s, in 1999, the US Air Force accidentally bombed the Chinese embassy in Belgrade. 3 Chinese in the embassy were killed. That was traumatic for both governments, but we got past that. And within 6 months after that, we had resolved the remaining issues and China got into the WTO. I think we can get past the balloon issue again.
Yeah. And you mentioned there kind of the dismantling or modification of kind of post World War II, right? NATO versus non-NATO. So maybe this is a good time to bring in kind of US, China, and Russia relations, given China's friendliness with Russia, obviously United States approach to Russia, really NATO or Western approach to Russia, and their interest in potentially brokering resolution there. So how do you think of kind of that trifecta of US, China, Russia, and what it really means to geopolitics?
Yeah, I think there are several factors at play here. One is we have to recognize that China shares a really, really long land border in its north with Russia. So what happens in Russia is really important to China just for that reason. I also feel like over the years, Chinese leaders would much rather have a closer relationship with Washington than with Moscow, even before Putin. But lately, that's been really difficult. They've been feeling besieged by US policy in the region. So I think a lot of the rhetorical support for Putin came from, well, if we can't have a better relationship with the United States, we certainly don't want to have a rocky relationship with our neighbor on the north. Now, I also think that the Chinese leadership was played by Putin, that they announced support for him last February when Putin came to Beijing for the Olympics, because I think Putin probably lied to them about what he was going to do in Ukraine. Now, they obviously had an opportunity to reverse course after we saw what happened with the invasion and the brutality there. They did not do that, and that's sad. But I think it's also important to remember that Chinese government's been really careful with this, with primarily providing rhetorical support. They have not crossed the line of breaching any of the US or EU sanctions on Putin and on Russia. And I know you've been hearing about reports that the US government is concerned that China might provide weapons to Putin, but they haven't done that yet. And I really think the odds of that happening are very, very low. I do not think that Xi Jinping will sell weapons to Putin because he knows that would be the end of constructive relations, not only with the United States, but with Europe as well. And for your audience members who are interested in this, we're at Matthews Asia going to be hosting a webcast on this subject on March 22nd with Dr. Bobo Lo, who's been for many years my go-to expert on China-Russia relations. We're going to be talking about all these issues with him, and we'd love to have any of you join us. I think they're going to be posting in the chat box on right now a link to sign up for that.
Yeah, and I would encourage listening to some of that content. Matthews Asia has really put out some great, thoughtful pieces with both internal speakers and external speakers contributing to that as well. But, Andy, maybe taking the US-China-Russia relationship one step further, many have made the analogy of, Russia and Ukraine similar to China and Taiwan. And you mentioned it in your opening remarks, kind of Taiwan and meeting with local officials, that there's really no immediate foresight for military or forcible action. But what is your view of China's short-term thoughts and policy to Taiwan and kind of their ultimate glide path, much like Hong Kong with, one country, two systems, right? What is the ultimate landing point, and how do we find from where we are today to where we can be in the future?
Great question. I think that there are tremendous differences in the Taiwan situation compared to both Hong Kong and Ukraine, but there are lessons that I think the Chinese government has learned from both of these things. Let's get to the summary right away. My view is that there is an extremely low risk of Xi Jinping using force against Taiwan. Xi Jinping has never said that he has a timetable by which he wants to achieve unification with Taiwan. And he always talks about a preference for peaceful resolution of the problem. And then a few other things I'd add to that. One is there's no domestic pressure in China for him to use force on Taiwan. When you talk to normal Chinese people, they'll tell you, hey, Taiwan's already part of China. That's what they've been taught in school. That's what they read in the newspaper. So nobody is out on the streets urging Xi Jinping to use force against people on Taiwan who are also Chinese. Second, the military risk would be enormous. And this is made clear by Ukraine. Putin only had to send his tanks over a land border in Ukraine. There's 100 miles of really difficult water between the mainland of China and Taiwan. Amphibious assaults are one of the most difficult things for militaries to accomplish. Only a handful of places where you can land on Taiwan. And of course, the Taiwan military and the US military know exactly where those places are. And if Xi Jinping was to get bogged down in an assault on Taiwan, the way Putin got bogged down in Ukraine, he could go down in history as the worst leader in modern China. So why would he want to take that risk? And then even more importantly for me, with my focus on economics, is it would be an economic disaster for China. Remember that the US, through its satellite intelligence, had months of advance warning that Putin was getting ready to attack Ukraine. We would have similar advance notice if Xi Jinping was massing forces, getting ready for casualties, getting ready for production of weapons. And we're not seeing that today, but we would know that in advance. And the US and our partners and allies in the region would clearly put massive sanctions on China. And remember that China is so much more globally integrated than Russia, so the pain would be that much bigger. China depends on imports for more than 70% of its oil consumption, more than 70% of its soybeans, animal feed, and more than 70% of its iron ore for steel. And maybe most importantly, more than 80% of China's semiconductor consumption is imported, with about a third of that coming from Taiwan. All of that would be cut off even before they launched an attack. All great reasons why I think Xi Jinping is not going to do that. Now, things are going to remain tense. It's going to be in the headlines. And I think it's going to be a challenge for all of us to understand what's happening there, given the propensity of the media to hype the low probability risks. But I'm not very worried about that.
Low probability risk sells, I guess. So I get that. We had a question come in, but it speaks to China's military advancements. I guess maybe even aggressions is the way the question is fielded, but maybe not just towards Taiwan, but just kind of their general tenor, right? So their actions in the South China Sea and kind of a buildup in military. Where do you think China over the long term sees itself as a military player in kind of the global complex, and maybe less about the Taiwanese Strait and more about just kind of their role broadly?
Yeah, I think it's worthwhile to look back to last week when the US Director of National Intelligence published the intelligence community's annual threat assessment for the United States. And in the section on China, the intelligence community of the United States said that they see China as trying to establish itself as the preeminent power in their region and to be one of the major players in the world. So this is our intelligence community together, all the different agencies that work on these issues, saying that they do not see China as trying to replace the United States as the sole superpower, as the world's hegemon. And I think that we just have to accept that China wants to do the same thing in its backyard that we want to do in our backyard, which is to be secure. And we have the military resources and the alliances, especially in Asia, to work with them on that. I mean, we have, I think, 30,000 Marines in Okinawa, which is closer to Shanghai than it is to Tokyo. We have a large force in Korea. So we're well prepared to continue to play a really big role in the region, as well as continue to be the global leader. And I think we don't need to overhype what China's trying to do.
Fair. So speaking kind of long-term, if you will, and kind of long-term trends, one of the conversations that often comes up with investors is just around populations and demographic growth, in particular China. And I know you had a recent, kind of piece out and conversation around maybe the myths around one policy or one child policies in China. But how do you see kind of demographics playing a role in the Chinese economy, and what does that really mean for us as investors as we look forward?
Yeah, that's another great question, Brad. Thanks. Yeah, demographics has played a really big role in the Chinese economy for the last 50 years. One of the reasons that the Chinese economy grew at a double-digit pace for about 10 years, right after the reform and opening up of China, was demographics. You had a really high birth rate, but more importantly, you had a change in policies by the Chinese government that allowed all the surplus labor in rural China to move into urban China and staff factories and construction sites and then restaurants and shops. And that was one of the reasons why we had double-digit growth. The change in those demographic trends is one of the reasons why China's never going to go back to double-digit growth again. Now, that doesn't mean the Chinese economy is weak or collapsing, because remember, GDP growth rates are a year-over-year figure that comes on top of a base that's gotten much bigger. So let me put it this way. Last year, China's growth rate was only about 5%, but that led to a net expansion in the size of the Chinese economy that was the biggest in its history. The expansion in China's GDP last year was about the size of the entire Mexican GDP at a slower growth rate than we'd seen a decade before. So the Chinese government knows this, and this is one of the reasons why they're taking steps in terms of tax policy, fiscal policy, to try and promote moving up the value chain in manufacturing, but also moving to services. So in the early days when we were investing in China, we saw China as a manufacturing powerhouse and an export leader. China still makes a lot of stuff, most of the world's iPhones, for example, most of the world's EVs, most of the world's solar panels. And they're still a big player in global trade. In fact, China's share of global exports is at an all-time high now. But last year was the 11th consecutive year in which the tertiary part of GDP, the services and consumer part, was the biggest part and generated all the growth. So increasingly, in large part because of demographics, China's economy is becoming more like ours, domestic demand driven. That's why if you take a look at what my colleagues on the Matthews Asia investment team are investing in on behalf of their clients, it's primarily Chinese companies selling goods and services to Chinese consumers.
So I know we have just a couple of minutes left here, Andy, and maybe not taking fully off your economist hat, but on the investment side as well. At Matthews Asia, what is the outlook for investment in China, right? Because the economy and the market, they're related, but they're more cousins than they are twins. They're not directly overlapping. And so when you think of opportunity for investment across Asia, but in particular China, is it a space that your fellow portfolio managers are excited about, or what's the tenor and outlook today?
Yeah, we're certainly very excited. And let me talk about the opportunities for a minute, and then I'm going to talk about the risks for a couple of minutes as well, because that's important. The opportunities, as I mentioned at the outset, we're seeing a post-COVID economic recovery, just like we've had in the United States. And this is supported by that huge buildup in family bank deposits that I mentioned before, also supported by the fact that fiscal and monetary policy are continuing to be eased in China, as in contrast to the rest of the world. And then also keep in mind that over the last decade, on average, every year, China's accounted for about 1/3 of global economic growth. That's a larger share of global growth than from the US, Europe, and Japan combined. So I think it's really important for investors to think about whether they want to have a bit of exposure to that driver of global growth, particularly right now when you've got the recovery in domestic demand and accommodative monetary and fiscal policy there. Also, valuations are relatively low right now, so there are opportunities there. Now, there are risks. Let's talk about that for a minute. One of the risks is, does the Chinese government do dumb things with its economic policy? Because they have made mistakes before. I mentioned briefly earlier that they made some mistakes over the last few years on property, on tech regulation. I think the risk of them repeating those kinds of mistakes in the near future is very low, because they're just coming out of a cycle of having made those mistakes, acknowledged the mistakes, and now they're in the process of correcting them. So I think we're in for a period of time where policies are going to be very much focused on supporting growth. So that risk is low. So I think the number one risk is one of the issues that we were just talking about, US-China relations. Clearly, this is in a difficult period of time right now, especially following the balloon. But as I alluded to earlier, I believe that leaders in both Beijing and Washington understand the importance of having a strong bilateral relationship for their own people and for the world. It's really important for our farmers. Imports from China help keep the cost of tradable goods down, keep inflation low, which is really important for working class families here. I think the Biden administration knows that. I take heart from the comments that the new premier, the number two in the government, made last night in his press conference about wanting to get the relationship back on track again. So that risk is there. But I think especially given that we can focus on Chinese companies selling goods and services to Chinese consumers, as opposed to companies that are trying to export to the United States and facing tariffs here, for example, I think there are great ways for American investors to get some exposure to that driver of global growth.
Yeah. Well, Andy, we're right at time. Thank you so much for your comments, really giving insight and kind of demystifying to a great degree what's going on in China. For those that have an opportunity, feel free to log into Matthew's Asia website, and he writes a great column, Sinology. Also, for those, there was a lot of on Russia-China relations. Andy mentioned, and we included in the link, the March 22nd, correct?
That's right.
March 22nd conversation with Dr. Bobo Lo. That should be a great discussion to unpack relations there. So Andy, thank you so much for spending some time with us, and for everyone that dialed in, we really appreciate it. Thanks so much.